Have you ever reached a point where life just didn't make sense anymore? Where your prayers felt unanswered, your strength ran out, and all you could do was wonder if you'd ever feel okay again? You're not alone, and more importantly, you're not without help. What if your greatest source of strength isn't in fixing the problem, but in being carried through it? What if grace isn't a soft word, but a powerful force designed to hold you up when everything else collapses? And what if, right now, in the middle of your struggle, God's grace is doing more than you can see? We don't talk enough about pain in spiritual spaces. Too often there's a pressure to look fine, sound strong, and act like faith makes you invincible. But faith doesn't erase suffering. It gives you the courage to walk through it. Faith introduces you to grace, a lifeline, not a ladder. You don't have to climb your way out. Grace comes down to meet you where you are. Life brings storms. They come in forms like financial loss, heartbreak, betrayal, chronic illness, spiritual dryness, anxiety, depression, or the silent ache of feeling unseen. Some storms roar with noise, others whisper with loneliness. But every storm leaves the same question behind. How do I survive this? This podcast isn't about denying reality or pretending that pain doesn't exist. It's about learning what it means to be sustained, not by hype or willpower, but by the quiet, unstoppable flow of God's grace. Grace is not just forgiveness, it's fuel. It's not only what saves you, it's what keeps you breathing when you feel like giving up, and it's available to you right now. Billy Graham once said, "Mountaintops are for views and inspiration, but fruit is grown in the valleys." We don't like valleys, but that's where transformation happens. Grace doesn't grow pride, it grows humility. And humility is where we start to see the miracle hidden in our weakness. What if weakness isn't a failure, but an invitation? An invitation to stop relying on yourself and to receive something you can't manufacture, divine strength. That's what Paul discovered when he begged God to take away his suffering. The answer wasn't what he expected. God said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." That word, sufficient, doesn't mean minimal. It means enough, more than enough. It means you will make it through not because you're tough, but because grace is steady. You may bend, but you won't break. You may cry, but you won't collapse. Grace holds you in invisible ways. We'll spend the next moments together exploring how this grace shows up in the middle of pain. Through ancient stories and present-day reflection, we'll uncover why grace doesn't always remove the storm, but it always changes the person walking through it. If you've been running on empty, if you've questioned whether God still sees you, this message is for you. You don't have to figure everything out right now. You don't have to fix yourself before you're allowed to rest. You are allowed to collapse into the arms of grace. Because when everything else is too much, God is still enough. Pain comes in many forms. Sometimes it's loud and immediate. A phone call in the night, a sudden loss, a diagnosis you didn't see coming. Other times it creeps in quietly, like slow erosion. The grind of disappointment, the ache of being misunderstood, the weariness of carrying burdens no one else sees. And often that pain feels amplified by silence, not just the silence of people, but what feels like the silence of God. You pray, and the heavens don't answer. You seek, and nothing moves. You wonder, is anyone even listening? In these moments, even the strongest faith can feel fragile. The verses you once clung to might now feel distant. Songs of hope feel hollow. You try to speak words of courage, but they stick in your throat. You begin to doubt, not just God's presence, but your worth. You think that you've failed somehow, that this suffering is punishment, or worse, abandonment. But none of that is true, not even close. The reality is that even Jesus on the cross cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That moment didn't mean God was absent. It meant that Jesus fully entered into our human suffering, even our feelings of being forsaken. He didn't avoid the worst pain, he went through it. And that's the grace we begin to understand. Not a God who spares us from pain, but a God who joins us in it. Grace often looks different than we expect. We want rescue, and grace gives us resilience. We want escape, and grace offers endurance. We want answers, and grace gives us presence. It's not a miracle that takes you out of the fire. It's the unseen strength that keeps you from being consumed by it. It doesn't always fix what's around you, but it always sustains what's within you. You may feel like you're losing control. That's okay. Grace doesn't ask you to hold everything together. It invites you to let go, to stop pretending, to allow your cracks to show, because that's where light can enter. Scripture doesn't say God helps those who help themselves. It says He helps the helpless, the broken, the weary, the honest. There's something holy about honesty. When you stop trying to impress God and start telling Him the truth, that you're tired, scared, angry, or numb, grace steps in. Not with judgment, but with peace. The kind of peace that makes no sense to the world. The kind of peace that wraps around you when you're surrounded by chaos. The kind of peace that doesn't come from things going right, but from knowing you're not alone when everything's going wrong. You are not forgotten. You are not unseen. You are not too broken to be held by God. Grace doesn't wait for you to be fixed. It meets you right in the middle of your mess and says, I'm here. I'm not leaving. And I will carry you through this. Even now, when things feel uncertain, there's a quiet invitation. Not to understand everything, not to be stronger, just to receive, to exhale, to say, God, I need you. And to believe, however softly, that He's already with you. Grace doesn't require noise or drama. It often comes in whispers, in the stillness after tears, in the breath between sobs, in the sacred pause when you have nothing left to say. It is steady. It is real. It is enough. You don't have to climb your way to hope. Sometimes hope finds you where you're lying face down. That's the beauty of grace. It moves first, it reaches further, and it never runs out. One of the most powerful truths about grace is that it often enters not in our victories, but in our defeats. There's something about reaching the end of ourselves that creates the opening for God to step in. Not because He was absent before, but because we finally stopped trying to be our own savior. It's in the breakdown that grace begins its quiet rebuilding. Take Joseph, for example. Betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, imprisoned for years. His life was one long chapter of unjust suffering. And yet the Bible tells us over and over again, but the Lord was with Joseph. God didn't prevent the betrayal, He didn't stop the lies, He didn't immediately rescue Joseph from prison, but He was present through it all, working behind the scenes, shaping a future that Joseph couldn't see at the time. That's how grace works. It's not always loud, it's not always visible, but it is always active. Sometimes we look for God in the spotlight moments, in the breakthroughs, the miracles, the clear answers. But more often, grace is working in the shadows, in the delays, in the moments that feel like silence but are actually full of purpose. What Joseph learned, and what we're invited to believe, is that suffering is not the end of the story. Grace doesn't just sit with us in the pit, it slowly lifts us, matures us, transforms us. Joseph entered Egypt as a slave, but he left prison as a man prepared to save a nation. Grace is what turns scars into strategies, wounds into wisdom, and pain into preparation. You might not see it now, but there is a purpose in your process. That doesn't mean everything is good. Some things are truly evil, deeply painful, and unjust, but even those things can be used by God. As Joseph later told his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is grace. The ability of God to take what was intended to destroy you and use it to bless others through you. When you allow grace to carry you, you begin to stop fighting the season you're in. You begin to see the value even in the valley. You begin to let go of asking why me and start asking what now. Grace shifts your focus from survival to growth. It reminds you that your circumstances don't define your identity. God does, and He calls you loved, chosen, sustained. There's an unexpected power in surrender. Not giving up, but giving over. When you place your pain into God's hands, you give Him space to do what only He can do. Grace doesn't promise instant results. It doesn't work on our timeline, but it does promise presence. It promises strength for today and hope for tomorrow. Sometimes grace will protect you from things. Other times, it will preserve you through them. Either way, you're never left alone. The same God who walked with Joseph in a dungeon walks with you in your disappointments. The same God who waited with Joseph in obscurity waits with you in your unanswered prayers. And the same God who eventually elevated Joseph will not waste your journey either. You are not being overlooked. You are being prepared. Grace has a way of developing what success can never teach. In the shadows of waiting, you are learning to trust. In the depths of disappointment, you are learning to endure. And in the silence, you are learning to listen. God is doing something beneath the surface. You may not see it yet, but the story is still unfolding. Grace is not finished with you. You are not stuck. You are being shaped. There is more ahead, and grace is already there, making a way. When we think of suffering, it's easy to see it as something to be avoided at all costs. We instinctively resist pain, run from discomfort, and do everything we can to escape the weight of adversity. But grace invites us to view suffering through a different lens, not as a punishment, but as a place where something sacred can take root. Nowhere is this more evident than in the life of Job. Job was a man described as blameless and upright, someone who feared God and shunned evil. And yet, in a single stretch of time, he lost his children, his wealth, his health, and the support of his closest relationships. It's the kind of suffering that makes most people question everything. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why would a loving God allow such devastation? But here's what makes Job's story resonate with so many. He didn't hide his pain. He cried out. He questioned. He sat in the ashes. He didn't mask his emotions behind shallow religious platitudes. He brought the full weight of his grief to God, and still in the midst of his despair, he said one of the most remarkable lines in all of Scripture. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. That's not blind optimism. That's the depth of trust that can only be born in the fire. That's what grace does. It gives us the questions. It holds you while you ask them. It doesn't always remove the suffering, but it gives you the strength to stand within it. We live in a culture that wants answers and closure and control, but grace invites us into mystery, into the kind of faith that doesn't demand explanations, but dares to believe even in silence. For much of Job's journey, God didn't speak. There was no immediate comfort, no clear resolution, and yet grace was present. It was present in Job's honesty. It was present in his persistence. It was present in his refusal to let go, even when he didn't understand. In our own lives, we'll face moments that defy explanation, prayers that feel unanswered, losses that feel unbearable. And in those times, the temptation is to believe we've been abandoned. But grace whispers a different truth. It says, I'm still here. Even when you can't hear God, he hasn't moved. His silence is not absent. Sometimes it's space, for growth, for healing, for transformation. Eventually, God does respond to Job, not with answers, but with presence. He reminds Job of his vastness, his wisdom, and his intimate involvement in creation. He doesn't explain every detail of Job's suffering, but he assures him of one thing: I am with you. I see you. I have not forsaken you. And for Job, that is enough. This is where grace becomes not just a concept, but a lifeline. It is what anchors you when your world has been turned upside down. It's what holds your heart when nothing else makes sense. Grace says that even your worst days are not wasted. They are soil for something eternal. Something that may not bloom now, but will bloom in time. When everything in your life is stripped away, what remains? That's where grace begins to build. Not on the foundation of comfort or success, but on raw, unfiltered surrender. When Job had nothing left, he still had worship. He still had a cry. He still had God. And in the end, his restoration wasn't just material. It was spiritual. It was deeper than before. More grounded. More real. If you find yourself in a season where the losses are piling up and God feels distant, let Job's story remind you. Grace still works in the ashes. You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt. You don't have to rush to be okay. But you can trust that your pain is seen, your cries are heard, and your heart is held. Grace doesn't need you to have all the answers. It simply asks you to stay open, to stay honest, to keep breathing. Because even now, especially now, you are not alone. Grace is with you, in the questions, in the silence, in the sacred space where hope still whispers your name. When the Apostle Paul spoke of his thorn in the flesh, he didn't describe exactly what it was. We're not told if it was physical pain, emotional torment, spiritual struggle, or something else entirely. And maybe that ambiguity is the point. Because whatever it was, we've all had our own version of it. Something persistent, unrelenting, and beyond our control. Something that doesn't go away, no matter how much we pray. And in that place of unanswered pleading, Paul encountered something deeper than relief. He encountered grace. We often think of grace as a one-time gift, something that happens at the moment of salvation. But Paul shows us that grace is also an ongoing supply, a daily, moment-by-moment provision. It's not just the door into faith, it's the strength that carries you through the hallway. And sometimes it doesn't remove the weight, it just makes it bearable. Paul says he pleaded with God 3 times to take it away. Think about that. This was a man who had healed others, cast out demons, preached to thousands. But this one thing, this thorn, remained. And the answer he received wasn't deliverance. It was a promise. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That's not the answer most of us want, but it might be the one we need. Because what if the presence of the thorn wasn't a sign of failure, but an invitation into a deeper intimacy with God? What if the things that don't change are the very places where grace teaches us how to live differently? Not by sight, not by control, but by trust. Paul didn't just endure the thorn. He reframed it. He said, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." That's the paradox of grace. It shines brightest where we feel weakest. It doesn't need your performance. It meets you in your limits. And somehow, mysteriously, it turns those limits into the very stage where God's strength is displayed. This isn't about romanticizing suffering. It's about recognizing that grace meets you in real places, with real power, and doesn't require you to be superhuman. There's a quiet power in admitting you can't do it alone. That confession isn't defeat, it's access. It's what opens the door for grace to move in ways self-sufficiency never could. Grace doesn't wait for you to earn it. It just asks that you stop pretending you don't need it. Too often, we measure spiritual maturity by how much we accomplish or how strong we appear. But Paul flips that idea on its head. He says, "When I am weak, then I am strong." In a world that celebrates invincibility, grace celebrates dependence. And not the kind of dependence that leads to passivity, but the kind that awakens perseverance, resilience, deep-rooted faith. You might be carrying a thorn right now. Something no one else sees. Something you've asked God to take away. And maybe it still hurts. Maybe the silence is loud. But that doesn't mean grace isn't present. In fact, it might mean that grace is doing its deepest work. Not fixing the circumstance, but forming your soul. Not removing the struggle, but revealing the strength that was never yours to begin with. There is freedom in letting go of the need to be strong all the time. Grace doesn't require perfect prayers. It only asks for honest hearts. The kind that say, "God, I don't understand, but I trust you." The kind that show up even in pain. The kind that rest even without resolution. Paul didn't see his thorn as a curse. He saw it as a vessel. A reminder that he was never the source of his strength. And maybe that's the lesson for us too. That grace isn't just a rescue plan. It's a daily rhythm, a faithful companion, a source of power when you've run out of yours. So whatever your thorn may be, whatever won't go away, know this: you are not being punished. You are being held. You are not forgotten. You are being strengthened. Grace has not abandoned you. It is alive in you. And even in your weakest place, it is more than enough. Grace is not always loud. It doesn't always arrive like thunder or lightning. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the ordinary, in a quiet moment when you finally exhale, in a conversation that softens your heart, in the stillness after a long cry. Grace doesn't need to announce itself to be powerful. Its strength is often felt most when everything else feels like it's unraveling. In these moments, when you've reached the edge of what you can do, grace whispers, "You're not done yet, I've still got you." There's something sacred about the still places. In the chaos of life, we often overlook silence, assuming that activity equals progress. But grace teaches us that stillness isn't emptiness, it's preparation. In the quiet, grace works behind the scenes. It repairs what we can't, calms what we don't understand, and sets a foundation for what comes next. And in that stillness, you begin to see that grace is not just a concept, it's a presence. Imagine walking through a dark season, not knowing what's ahead, unsure how you'll make it, but still taking one more step. That's grace. Not always the removal of difficulty, but the courage to keep going. Grace is the hand that reaches for you in the dark, the breath that fills your lungs when anxiety squeezes tight, the calm that reminds you you're not lost even when you feel directionless. It is the friend who shows up when no one else knows what to say. It is the scripture that lands differently today than it did yesterday. It is God's heartbeat echoing in your quiet moments of surrender. We often want big signs. We want clarity, answers, breakthroughs. But grace isn't always in the fire or the wind. It's often in the gentle whisper. When Elijah stood on the mountain, waiting for God to reveal himself, it wasn't the earthquake or the fire that held God's presence. It was the soft, low whisper. That's how grace works. It doesn't overwhelm, it enters. If you've ever felt like you're drifting, like life has become a blur and your purpose feels cloudy, that space is not empty. It's not wasted. It may be where grace is doing its best work. Because in the quiet, you're not distracted, you're not performing. You're just you, raw, honest, tired maybe, but real. And grace meets the real you, not the polished version. There's a beauty in realizing you don't have to strive to be loved. You don't have to produce to be worthy. You don't have to achieve to be accepted. Grace removes the scoreboard. It silences shame. It says you are already enough, not because of what you've done, but because of who I am. And that changes everything. You begin to live not for approval, but from a place of security. Not to earn, but to rest. And resting in grace is not passive. It's brave. It's countercultural. In a world that shouts more, faster, better, grace invites you to slow down, to breathe, to trust. It reminds you that God's timing is not your timing, and that's a good thing. What He's building in you can't be rushed. Some roots only grow deep in silence. There's also a humility that comes with grace. You start to realize you don't have to have all the answers. You can let go of the pressure to figure everything out. You can admit that you're not okay and not feel like a failure. Because grace says being human isn't a problem. It's the very reason Jesus came. And when you live from grace, you start to see others differently too. You become gentler, more patient, more aware of the battles people are quietly fighting. Grace received becomes grace extended, and your own healing becomes a doorway for someone else's hope. So if you're in a space right now that feels unclear, where nothing seems to be moving, know this: grace is not absent. It's not waiting on the other side of your breakthrough. It's with you now, in the ordinary, in the unanswered, in the waiting. And while you may not see the full picture, you can trust that grace sees you, that it's already at work, and that even in silence, obsessed with self-help. Scroll through your social feed, walk through a bookstore, and you'll see it everywhere. Messages telling you to hustle harder, think more positively, manifest your goals, take control of your destiny. And while some of those things may offer temporary motivation, they're not the same as healing. They don't address the root of our weariness. Because deep down, most of us aren't just tired from doing too much. We're tired from carrying things we were never meant to carry alone. That's where grace steps in. Grace isn't a life hack. It's not a productivity tool. It doesn't ask you to optimize yourself. Grace says, stop striving. I've already made a way. That goes against everything culture tells us. We're trained to believe we need to earn love, prove worth, and fix ourselves. But grace declares the opposite. It tells you that you don't have to climb higher to be accepted. You don't have to do more to be loved. You don't have to be stronger to be safe. That doesn't mean we stop growing or changing. It means that growth begins from rest, not pressure. When grace enters, it rewrites your motivations. You no longer strive to prove yourself. You respond to the love that already holds you. And that changes everything. There's a clear distinction between grace and self-help. Self-help says, you got this. Grace says, you don't, but I do. Self-help relies on your ability. Grace depends on God's ability. Self-help tells you to dig deeper. Grace says, I've already gone deeper for you. And the truth is, even if you follow every tip and tactic, you'll still hit moments where nothing works. That's not failure. It's a reminder that you were never meant to do life on your own. The most freeing thing about grace is that it relieves you from the burden of self-salvation. You don't have to rescue yourself. You don't have to carry every weight. Grace invites you to collapse, not in defeat, but into rest. It invites you to say, I can't do this anymore, and not feel ashamed of that honesty. Because God isn't waiting for your strength. He's drawn to your weakness. Think of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, the King of Heaven kneeling in the dust to serve the broken. That's grace. It stoops, it serves, it doesn't avoid mess, it enters it. And it tells you, even if you've failed, even if you've fallen short, I'm not walking away. That's not the language of self-help. That's the language of mercy. Grace doesn't demand performance. It offers presence. It replaces shame with dignity. It silences the lie that you have to earn your place in God's love. You already have it, fully, right now, in your unedited, uncertain, undone self. And once that truth settles into your soul, you begin to live differently. You're not afraid to admit your needs. You're not afraid to ask for help. You're not chasing approval anymore. You're walking in the assurance that you already belong. That security creates room to heal, to forgive, to grow, not under pressure, but in peace. Grace also teaches you how to walk with others. When you've been carried by grace, you stop judging people for struggling. You stop offering shallow fixes. You learn to sit with them in silence, to hold space for their story, to remind them that healing isn't about getting it together, it's about letting God in. And that might be the most radical part of grace. It meets you where you are, but it never leaves you there. It walks with you step by step, not rushing you, not shaming you, just gently guiding you back to wholeness. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to feel weak, and you're allowed to need grace again tomorrow. So maybe today, instead of trying harder, you could stop and breathe. Not because everything is fixed, but because you are not alone in the fixing. Maybe today, grace wants to remind you that being human is not the problem. Pretending you don't need help is. And the good news? You don't have to pretend anymore. You don't have to hustle your way into peace. Grace is already yours. There's a quiet ache that lives inside most of us, the ache of not being enough, of not doing enough, of wondering if we're truly accepted. It shows up when we fail, when we feel unseen, when we compare ourselves to others and come up short. It hides behind our busyness and our overthinking. It whispers questions we're too afraid to say out loud. Am I really loved? Am I really safe? Am I too far gone? And to every one of those questions, grace responds with the same unchanging voice. Come as you are mine. But how do we actually receive grace? How do we let it move from being just an idea to something we actually feel, something we actually live by? The answer isn't as complicated as we might expect. We don't have to earn it. We don't have to wait until we've cleaned up every mess. Receiving grace begins with one thing: honesty. There's something powerful about simply saying, God, I need you. Not as a last resort, but as a first instinct. That admission, raw, simple, and unfiltered, is often the exact moment when grace breaks through. Because grace isn't waiting for a perfect prayer. It meets you in the whispered cries, in the exhausted silence, in the breathless help. Scripture is filled with moments where people encountered grace by simply turning toward God. The prodigal son didn't come home with a speech that earned forgiveness. He just came home. And before he could even explain himself, the father ran to meet him. That's grace. It moves faster than our guilt. It interrupts our shame with love. It doesn't wait for us to prove anything. It meets us the second we take a step in God's direction. But grace doesn't just meet you once. It keeps showing up, over and over. In the mornings you don't feel like getting up. In the prayers that feel too heavy to finish. In the decisions you regret. In the moments you think you've run out of second chances. Grace is not fragile. It is fierce. It is steady. It does not wear out, even when you do. So how do you live from grace instead of guilt? It starts by changing the question. Instead of how do I fix this, ask where is God in this? Instead of how do I perform better, ask what truth am I forgetting? Grace invites you to remember what's already been done, that you are loved, forgiven, held, and that your value doesn't fluctuate with your behavior. That doesn't mean we ignore growth. Grace doesn't excuse sin. It transforms the heart. But transformation starts with belonging, not behavior. When you believe you're loved, you stop running, you stop hiding, you start healing. And healing creates room for everything else to grow. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is slow down. To stop trying to earn a place that's already yours. To breathe, to be still. To let God remind you who you are, not based on what the world says, but based on what He says. You are my child. In you, I delight. You can create space for grace in simple ways. In the quiet of the morning before your phone turns on, in a journal where you write without censoring yourself, in moments of silence where you let your heart speak, in a walk without headphones, in a deep breath before a difficult conversation. Grace is not limited to church pews or religious rituals. It's woven into the everyday. You don't need the perfect environment to receive grace. You just need willingness. Willingness to be real, to be open, to say, I don't have it all together, and to believe that God isn't shocked or disappointed. He's near. That nearness is grace. The assurance that you are not alone in your fears, your questions, or your healing. Receiving grace doesn't mean life gets easier, but it does mean you're no longer carrying the weight alone. It means you can walk forward without pretending. You can face yourself without flinching. You can sit in your imperfection and still call it sacred. Because grace isn't for the polished version of you, it's for the real one. And maybe that's the whole point, that you don't have to chase grace. It's been chasing you all along. All it needs is a door. And sometimes that door opens with just one sentence. God, I need you, not to prove anything, not to earn anything, just to receive, just to rest, just to begin again. There's a moment, after the chaos has quieted and the noise has faded, where grace begins to echo. It's not the absence of struggle that makes the echo clear, it's the presence of endurance. When you've lived through something that should have broken you but didn't, you begin to realize the strength was never yours to begin with. It was grace. And now that grace becomes your story. Your story doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to have a perfect ending. It only needs to be real. People don't connect with your perfection. They connect with your process. And when grace meets your process, it turns pain into testimony. The things that once caused you to hide can now become the things that help others heal. Not because you're the hero, but because grace did what nothing else could do. It stayed. There's something holy about scars. Not the wounds themselves, but the healed places. The parts of you that remember what was broken and now bear quiet proof that healing happened. When you share your scars, you're not glorifying pain. You're testifying to restoration. Grace takes the darkest chapters and makes them the most powerful ones. The parts of your story you once tried to erase become the very pages someone else needs to read. Your suffering is never meaningless. It's soil. And what grows out of it is often fruit that feeds others. You may not realize it now, but someone is waiting on the other side of your healing. Someone needs to hear how you survived. Someone is looking for proof that they're not alone in what they're feeling. And your story, covered in grace, wrapped in truth, might be the confirmation they've been praying for. You don't have to have it all figured out to share your journey. In fact, sometimes it's the unfinished testimonies that resonate the most. The I'm still in it, but I'm still breathing kind. The I don't have answers, but I've seen enough to believe kind. Because grace doesn't require a bow-tied ending. It just asks for honesty. And honesty is what makes your story powerful. Grace reclaims what shame tried to bury. It replaces guilt with courage. It tells you that the thing you thought disqualified you might be the very thing God uses most. He doesn't waste your weakness. He redeems it. And he redeems it not only for your sake, but for the sake of others who are walking through the same valley, looking for light. When grace becomes your story, it changes your posture. You stop hiding. You stop shrinking. You start stepping forward, not to impress, but to invite. Not to perform, but to connect. Your voice becomes a doorway for someone else's breakthrough. And in telling your story, you are reminded again and again that grace is real, that it worked then, and it's still working now. Don't underestimate the power of what you've lived through. Even if it felt like survival, even if it looked messy, even if you're still healing, your endurance is evidence. And that evidence is a gift. You don't have to have perfect theology or the right words. You just have to be willing. Grace will speak through you. You are not what happened to you. You are not defined by your darkest moment. You are a canvas for what grace can do. Every time you choose compassion over bitterness, faith over fear, honesty over pride, you are bearing witness to grace at work. And that witness is powerful. Maybe you've kept your story quiet. Maybe you've believed the lie that it's too broken to help anyone. But grace disagrees. Grace sees your past and says, I can use this. Grace sees your shame and says, let me redeem this. Grace sees your fear and says, I'll walk with you through it. When you begin to see your story through grace, it no longer holds you hostage. It becomes a testimony, not of how strong you were, but of how faithful God is. And in that shift, something beautiful happens. Others find courage, others find hope. Others see that if God could carry you, maybe He can carry them too. That's the power of grace. It multiplies, it moves, it speaks, and it never ever returns empty. Not every chapter of your story will be joyful. Not every page will read like a victory. Some parts will be messy, confusing, even heartbreaking. But grace doesn't skip those pages. It moves straight into them, highlighting the beauty in the broken, the purpose in the pain, and the strength that somehow survived it all. And by the time you look back, you'll see it wasn't the easy moments that shaped you most. It was the ones where grace carried you. Because that's what grace does. It doesn't always take away the burden. Sometimes it just makes you stronger underneath it. It doesn't always answer the why, but it always shows you the how you made it, how you changed, how you stayed standing when nothing around you made sense. That quiet strength, that invisible thread holding you together, is the fingerprint of grace. You may never fully understand why you walked through what you did, but you can choose what you carry out of it. Will it be bitterness, or will it be wisdom? Will it be shame, or will it be testimony? Grace gives you the power to decide, and it always invites you toward freedom. Freedom from the lie that you're too far gone. Freedom from the weight of pretending you're okay. Freedom from the fear that your story has no value. Your story is sacred. Because grace wrote its way through every chapter, even the ones you tried to rip out. This isn't a call to ignore your pain. It's a call to stop letting it define your identity. You are not what happened to you. You are not the failure, the trauma, the mistake. You are who grace says you are. Loved, redeemed, carried, and becoming. Every scar holds a lesson. Every ache has the potential to become an anthem. And you get to decide what sound your life will make. If you feel like your life has been on pause, like the dreams you once had have been buried under reality, grace hasn't forgotten. It doesn't operate on your timeline. It works in seasons, in layers, in quiet progress. You may not feel it every day, but it's always present, still moving, still healing, still making a way. And maybe the greatest miracle is not that your circumstances change, but that you do. That you come out softer, not bitter, wiser, not wounded, faithful, not fearful, that you learn how to live with an open heart again, that you begin to trust that God's goodness wasn't absent just because things were hard. It was hidden, doing work too deep to see. Grace doesn't need a perfect setting. It blooms in the dark, it grows in silence, and it proves that even in the worst of times, something holy is happening. You are being shaped, molded, restored, not by force, but by presence. The presence of a God who never let go, even when you thought He did. As this chapter comes to a close, you might still have questions. You might still feel unsure. But grace doesn't require clarity. It only asks for your openness. To keep walking, to keep trusting, to believe, even in the quiet, that your story is not over, that something beautiful is still unfolding. So if you've been wondering where God is in all of this, if you've been waiting for permission to rest, to hope, to begin again, this is it. This is your reminder. You're not behind. You're not forgotten. You're not broken beyond repair. You are held. You are known. You are loved. And grace is still writing your story. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this message resonated with your heart, if it reminded you that you're not alone in your struggle, we invite you to keep walking this journey with us. Subscribe to Think Fresh Daily for more content that helps you breathe deeper, hope bigger, and live grounded in grace. You are welcome here.